The morning Malcolm Vail came home, the sky over Atlanta sat low and gray, the kind of sky that doesn't decide between rain and cloud. Hartsfield-Jackson International hummed the way it always did. Luggage wheels on polished floors, the flat voice of the intercom calling gates, the particular cold of terminal air that smells like nowhere and everywhere at once. Outside the arrivals exit, a convoy waited. One limousine, black and long, engine idling. Two SUVs flanking it, dark windows, government plates. A man in a dark suit stood beside the rear door with his hands clasped and his eyes on the terminal entrance. A woman in a navy blazer held a tablet and checked it every 30 seconds. Two others in plain clothes moved without appearing to move, the way people trained for security do. It was not the kind of convoy that waited long. It was the kind that waited for exactly one person. Mason Vail had dressed carefully that morning. He wore his best suit, charcoal gray, bought 3 years ago for his nephew's wedding, and kept since for occasions that mattered. His tie was straight. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He stood beside his wife, Elise, near the rope barrier outside the VIP exit, and he watched the convoy the way a man watches something he has always believed belongs to a certain kind of world, the world of real importance. Elise had her coat folded over one arm and her eyes on the terminal door. She had not spoken for several minutes. That was not unusual. Elise often went quiet when Mason was already speaking inside his own head. He had been speaking inside his own head all morning. He had told 3 people this week that his son was coming home. Told them about the government work, the federal position, the long hours. He used the word important the way you use a coat that's slightly too big. It covered everything but didn't fit quite right. Then the terminal door opened and Malcolm walked out. He carried one bag. A rolling suitcase, modest, black, no luxury markings. In his right hand was a folder, navy blue, thick with paper, the kind that doesn't leave an office unless it's needed somewhere. He wore his uniform, dark jacket, pressed collar, a small identification badge clipped near the breast pocket. No fanfare, no entourage. He walked the way men walk when they've been walking toward hard things for a long time. Mason watched his son move through the crowd. He watched him angle left toward the VIP exit zone. He watched the distance between Malcolm and the convoy close, step by step, and something in Mason's chest tightened the way a fist does when it believes it's about to protect something. He stepped forward. Malcolm, his son slowed but didn't stop. "Don't go near that limo." The words came out louder than Mason intended. A few heads turned. A man with a carry-on looked over his shoulder. A woman near the kiosk paused. Malcolm stopped. He turned to look at his father, with an expression that was very still and very old, like a door that has been opened and closed so many times the hinges have learned to expect it. Mason lowered his voice, but not by much. "I'm serious. You can't just walk up to a vehicle like that. Those cars are for people there's protocol, son. You don't know who's expected," Elise said quietly. "Mason." But Mason did not stop. He stepped closer to Malcolm and spoke in the urgent half-whisper of a man who believes he is preventing disaster. "Your work is fine. What you do is fine, but you need to know where you stand. You walk up to a car like that, people are going to think I'm what?" The question came flat and calm. Not aggressive, not wounded, just present. Mason did not answer. A woman in a navy blazer materialized from near the barrier. Young, polished, tablet in hand, the kind of professional cordiality that is trained rather than felt. "Sir, this is a restricted area. If you're not part of the secure party, I need you to step back." Mason turned to her immediately, gesturing toward Malcolm, with the automatic motion of a man used to managing situations. "I apologize, my son got turned around. He's here to meet us, he didn't mean to." "Cha." One word, Malcolm's voice. Not loud, not pleading. Mason went quiet. He watched his son look at him across a silence that was not angry and not sad but simply honest. The way a field looks after a long drought, all the pretense dried away. Then from the convoy, a door opened. Thomas Reed walked out. He was 60-something, broad-shouldered, in a dark suit, with a federal insignia on the lapel. He walked past the liaison officer, past Mason Vail, past the small clutch of bystanders, who had accumulated at the edges of the moment. He walked with the certainty of a man who has never once been wrong about who he was looking for. He stopped in front of Malcolm. "Director Vail." He said it the way you say the name of a building, as a fact about the landscape.
"We've been expecting you."
"Governor Marlowe is already at the command center. Your convoy is ready when you are." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a large space going small. Mason Vail stood very still. The woman with the tablet looked down at her screen and up again and down again. Two businessmen who had been walking past had stopped without appearing to mean to. Malcolm looked at Thomas Reed. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. I'll be right there." Thomas nodded once and returned to the vehicle. The door was held open. Malcolm looked at his father. He did not say, "I told you." He did not say, "Now do you see?" He said nothing that could be used as a weapon, because he had long since learned that the truth doesn't need one. "I have to go. There's work waiting." He looked at his mother then, and something passed between them. Not words, not even a gesture. Just the recognition between two people who have understood the same thing for a very long time. He picked up his bag, walked to the limo. The door closed behind him, and the convoy pulled smooth and quiet into the Atlanta gray. Mason Vail stood at the edge of the arrival's curb and looked at the space where the car had been. On his breast pocket, under his hands, he held nothing, but his son, somewhere in that departing vehicle, wore a badge that read in small plain letters, M. Vail, Federal Emergency Logistics. Mason had never thought to read it. Elise stood beside him and didn't say a word. Some things, she had learned, do not need saying. Malcolm Vail had not set out to become the person the convoy waited for. He had simply kept working until the work became too important to ignore. He grew up in a house in southwest Atlanta, where the kitchen table doubled as a homework desk, and the front porch screens let in the summer heat along with the neighbor's radio. Mason drove delivery routes and managed a shipping dock and later a warehouse. He worked long, and he worked hard, and he believed with the conviction of a man who has watched money from the outside for years, that success announced itself, that it came with markers, the right car, the right title, the right handshake from the right person in the right room. He was not wrong about ambition. He was only wrong about what it looked like when it was real. Elise worked the school cafeteria, then a healthcare records office, then a county administrative office, where she typed reports and sorted correspondence for people whose names appeared in the newspaper. She saw the machinery of important things from close enough to understand that the machinery was often run by people who looked like nothing in particular. She saw this in Malcolm early. When he was 11, he reorganized the storage room at his uncle's auto shop because he couldn't stand watching people look for bolts in the same wrong places every day. When he was 16, he mapped alternate routes between his neighborhood and the library, because the bus schedule made no sense, and he could see on a hand-drawn grid where the gaps were. When he was 22, working his first job at a regional logistics coordination office, he stayed late 3 nights in a row to redesign a supply chain routing that was costing the county money and time, and, in one documented case, a delayed medical delivery to a nursing home on the east side. His supervisor, at the time, told him the report was good. His father, when Malcolm mentioned it at dinner, said, "Good. Keep your head down and your numbers clean." Malcolm kept his head down. He kept his numbers clean. He moved from regional coordination to state emergency preparedness to federal logistics oversight. He was involved in hurricane response, flood recovery, infrastructure crisis management. He spent 18 months helping design a response protocol for medical supply chains that was later adopted by 4 states. He never told his father any of this in detail. It would have sounded like bragging. And bragging in the Vail house was what people did when they were insecure about the real thing. Mason, for his part, was proud of Malcolm in the way that doesn't know how to say itself clearly. He told people Malcolm worked for the government, and he said it with a lift in his voice that was genuine. But government work, in Mason's frame, was stable. It was a pension and a badge and a desk, and it kept you out of the cold. It was respectable without being remarkable. He didn't know how to hold the fact that his quiet son had become someone a governor called when a city was running out of time. He didn't know because Malcolm had never found a way to tell him that wasn't going to sound like an accusation. There was something else Mason didn't know. He didn't know about the night in New Orleans, 4 years back, when a Category 3 storm had stalled over the coast, and the levee management system's communication network went dark at 2 a.m. Malcolm sat in a borrowed office with 3 colleagues and a stack of paper maps because the digital systems were down, and they rerouted 11 medical supply convoys by hand over the course of 6 hours. 3 hospitals received blood products before dawn. 2 nursing facilities in flood zones had their evacuation vehicles redirected in time. He didn't know about the testimony Malcolm gave before a federal oversight committee, quietly, without fanfare, in a hearing that ran 4 hours and was attended by 6 people and a court reporter that led directly to the reform of a procurement process that had been losing the government $11 million a year. He didn't know about the phone call from a woman in Memphis whose husband was diabetic and whose insulin delivery had been held up in a warehouse routing failure. Malcolm had worked the problem at 11 at night on a Saturday, and the medication arrived Sunday morning. She had sent a letter to the department. The department had filed it. Malcolm kept his own copy. He didn't keep it because he needed proof of his worth. He kept it because the work was never abstract to him. Behind every delayed shipment was a person. Behind every rerouted truck was a family. He had learned this at his mother's table in the county records office where Elise worked, where the files were full of real people waiting on systems that didn't always remember they were real. He wore the old watch because it reminded him of that time Elise had told him when she clasped it to his wrist on his certification day, keeps an account even when no one else does. The command center was not glamorous. It occupied 4 converted conference rooms in a state administrative building downtown. Borrowed space, government-issue furniture, fluorescent light, and the smell of coffee that had been running since 6 a.m. Maps covered one wall. A bank of monitors showed real-time logistics data, vehicle GPS, warehouse inventory levels, traffic overlays, dispatch radio feeds. Malcolm set his folder on the nearest table before he had taken off his jacket. Governor Ellen Marlowe crossed the room and shook his hand. She was direct the way people are when they've stopped having time for anything else. Director Vail, we appreciate you coming down personally. The situation warranted it. He meant it without ceremony. She heard it the same way. Across the room, a man in a well-cut suit stood with 2 people from his company and watched Malcolm the way a man watches something he doesn't yet have a strategy for. Preston Calloway ran Harrington Mobility Systems, the private logistics contractor currently holding the emergency transportation contract for the state. He was 48, successful in the way that contracts and political relationships make men successful, and he was not used to being questioned by someone who hadn't come through his own network, Director Vail. He extended a hand. Preston Calloway, Harrington, welcome to Atlanta. I trust the team has briefed you on our current operations. They have. Malcolm shook the hand and moved to the monitor wall. I'd like to start with the routing data. Specifically routes 12, 17, and 23. A coordinator pulled up the maps. Malcolm studied them. The room waited. He pointed to a section of the city's eastern corridor. This route adds 42 miles to the standard path. Why does it go through the Harrington Auxiliary Depot on Moreland? Preston smiled the smile of a man who has an answer prepared. Efficiency optimization. That depot allows for consolidated loading, which reduces. It increases cost per mile by 61% for those runs, and it delays delivery to the Lakewood and Edgewood districts by an average of 4 hours. The smile held, but something behind it didn't. There are logistical factors that don't always appear in aggregate data. What does appear in aggregate data, Malcolm said, still looking at the map, is that the 3 highest need areas in this response zone are also the 3 areas with the longest average delivery delays, and each of those delayed routes runs through a Harrington facility. where the company charges a storage and handling fee not included in the original contract. He opened his Navy folder and placed 3 printed documents on the table. Silence moved through the room like weather. "I'd like GPS raw data, warehouse logs, and radio transcripts from the last 96 hours. Preston said the data wasn't consolidated yet. Malcolm asked who could expedite it. The governor said she could. She said it looking at Preston in a way that did not require further explanation. Over the next 2 days, Malcolm did not sleep more than 4 hours. He worked the data the way he had always worked problems, methodically, quietly, without announcing what he was finding, until he had found enough to make it unmovable. The GPS logs, once pulled, showed clear patterns. Routes that should have taken 38 minutes were clocking 92. Warehouses tagged as at capacity, on official reports, had empty bays visible in dock camera timestamps. 13 invoices for emergency fuel expenditure referenced vehicles that had, according to GPS, not moved during the build hours. A coordinator named Diana, who had worked the emergency desk for 11 years, and who had been saying quietly, for 3 months, that something was wrong with the routing numbers, sat beside Malcolm for 6 hours on the second day and pulled every discrepancy into a single document. "I filed a concern report in September," she said. "I was told the data was incomplete. Was it?" "No." Malcolm looked at the filed concern. It had been reviewed by Preston Calloway's office and marked resolved. He noted this in his own document without saying anything about it. Preston attempted one more intervention the morning before the public briefing. He requested a private meeting with Governor Marlowe, which she declined. He submitted a written statement claiming the routing irregularities were the result of software migration errors, which Malcolm's team cross-referenced against the software migration schedule and found had occurred 4 months after the irregularities began. Preston did not submit further statements after that. That evening, Mason sat in the hotel room and turned on the television because the silence in the room had gotten to the kind of weight a person can't carry sitting still. He found a local news channel. The governor was at a podium. This city's emergency response is being led by Director Mason Vail of the Federal Emergency Logistics Division, who will be overseeing a full audit of current transportation contracts and ensuring that critical supplies reach the communities that need them most. The camera came out to Malcolm standing behind the podium. He wasn't at the microphone. He wasn't trying to be in the shot. He was simply there. Navy uniform, small badge, Navy folder tucked under his arm, and every person in that room was oriented toward him, the way iron filings orient toward a magnet. A reporter raised a hand. "Director Vail, are you suggesting there's been deliberate mismanagement of the emergency contracts?" Malcolm stepped to the microphone. "I'm suggesting that when a routing system consistently prioritizes areas by political value rather than need, and when that routing generates additional fees for the contracting company, the question of intent becomes unavoidable. We follow the data, and the data has a story to tell." He stepped back from the microphone. Mason did not move. Elise had come out of the bathroom and was standing in the doorway watching the television. She didn't look at her husband. She just watched the screen. Finally she said, "There he is." Not with triumph. Not with "I told you so." Just with the quiet recognition of a woman who has known something for a long time and is glad the world is finally catching up. Mason sat without moving. Elise came fully into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. She folded her coat across her lap the way she always folded things, carefully, because she'd spent a life understanding that care is what you give what matters to you. "He's been doing this for years," she said. Mason didn't answer. The flooding in Shreveport, 4 years ago. He coordinated the medical relief routes for 40 hours straight. He called me at 4 in the morning when it was done, not to tell me he'd finished, just to hear my voice, because there was no one else around at that hour who knew what it had cost him. She smoothed the coat. "He calls me Mason. Not to brag, just to breathe. You never told me any of that. You never asked the right questions." She said it without sharpness, a fact, not an accusation. When someone asks how your son is doing, you say fine. When someone asks what he does, you say government work. You never asked him to tell you what that meant. And when he was quiet about it, you decided that meant there wasn't much to tell. Mason looked at his hands. I thought I was keeping him realistic. You were keeping him small, Elise said, because small things don't risk disappointing you. She paused. He's not angry with you. He's tired of coming home and being seen as what you expected, instead of what's actually standing there. Mason turned off the television a few minutes later. He sat in the chair by the window and looked at the city lights and said nothing. He thought about what he had said at the airport, not just the words. The architecture of them, the assumption inside each one that his son needed to be pulled back, needed to be reminded where he stood, needed to be kept small enough to fit the picture Mason had been carrying for years. He thought about the badge. M. Vail, Federal Emergency Logistics. How many times he had been close enough to read it. How it had never occurred to him that there was anything in those words that should make him stop and look more carefully. The GPS data, when it came, told a clear story. 47 routes had been deliberately rerouted through Harrington auxiliary facilities over the past 11 weeks. In 23 of those cases, the rerouting added more than 30 minutes of delivery time. In 12 cases, delivery to medical facilities was delayed beyond emergency protocol thresholds. An email from Preston Calloway's account to a logistics manager, dated 9 weeks prior, read, "Delay poor districts first, no political cost. Absorb the savings into Q3 auxiliary fees." Governor Marlowe read the email twice. Then she called the State Inspector General's office. Malcolm had not raised his voice once in 3 days. The following evening, the governor held a public briefing. Malcolm stood at the edge of the room where he could see the whole board and everyone in front of it. Preston Calloway was present because he had been asked to answer questions before the Inspector General's referral went formal. Malcolm put the routing map on the screen. He put the email on the screen. He put the comparative delivery time data on the screen, laid side by side in columns. What was promised, what was delivered, who waited longer, and why. He didn't editorialize. The facts editorialized themselves. Some parts of this city were treated as having less political cost to delay, Malcolm said. That's not a logistics decision. That's a values decision. And the resources of this state's emergency infrastructure are not available to be used as a mechanism for profit at the expense of the people they're meant to serve. Mason sat in the third row. He had come not because he was invited exactly, but because he needed to see it with his own eyes. Not on a television screen, not filtered through the small word government, but here, in the same room. He watched his son speak. He watched the room listen. He watched Preston Calloway try twice to interrupt, and twice be answered by data that could not be interrupted. And he thought about all the years he had spent describing Malcolm to other people in words that were technically true and completely wrong. There were people in that room who had been waiting years for someone to put what they already suspected into a form that couldn't be argued away. Residents from Lakewood and Edgewood who had been told the delays were weather-related. A hospital supply coordinator who had been filing discrepancy reports for 8 months and getting back form letters. A city council member who had raised questions about the contract at a committee meeting and been told the data was being reviewed. Malcolm didn't speak to any of them individually. He didn't have to. The map on the screen spoke for him. The routes, the times, the pattern so clear once you saw it that you couldn't unsee it. After the briefing, he stood in the corridor outside and let the room empty. He was reviewing notes on his phone when Diana, the coordinator, came to find him. Ash said, "Thank you." He said, "You filed the report. You did the work." She shook her head. "I filed a report. You made sure it meant something." Malcolm looked at her for a moment. "That's how it's supposed to work," he said. "Someone tells the truth. Someone else makes sure it isn't buried." She nodded and went back inside. He stood there for another minute before Mason found him. Harrington Mobility Systems was suspended from emergency contracts pending investigation. The Inspector General's office opened a formal inquiry. Emergency routing was restructured under Malcolm's direct coordination. The 3 delayed districts prioritized. Within 18 hours, deliveries that had been 4 hours late were running on schedule. After the briefing ended, Mason found his son in the corridor outside the command room. He didn't come with a speech prepared. He said, "I stood in your way." Malcolm looked at him. Mason continued, and the words cost him the way honest things cost people who have not said them long enough. "I thought I was protecting you. From embarrassment. From looking wrong in the wrong place. But the truth is, you were never in the wrong place. I just couldn't see how far you'd gone because I was still looking at you from where I was standing years ago." Malcolm was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I didn't need you to see the convoy, Dad. I needed you not to assume I didn't belong in it." Mason nodded. He didn't try to cover it with more words. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry for that." It was not a small apology for a man like Mason Vail, for whom appearing right had been armor for a long time. But some armors, when they finally come off, leave the person underneath lighter than they expected. Elise stood a few feet away. She didn't come closer. She didn't need to. 3 months later, the system worked differently. Not perfectly. Systems rarely do, all at once. But the routing protocols were rebuilt with transparency requirements. Delivery timelines were made publicly trackable by district. Emergency contracts required independent audit clauses. The Harrington inquiry went to trial. Malcolm returned to Washington. He came back to Atlanta twice more that year, once for the case hearings, once in the quiet season after everything had settled. The second time, Mason came to the command center. He did not wear his best suit. He wore a jacket and a pair of slacks, and he carried 2 cups of coffee from a place around the corner because he hadn't known what else to bring, and he'd thought, "At least coffee is honest." He stood at the reception desk. A young woman looked up at him. He said, "I'm here to see Director Vail." She checked the log, picked up the phone. Malcolm came out from the back office 2 minutes later. He stopped when he saw his father standing in the doorway with coffee cups in both hands, and something different in his posture. Not the self-conscious erectness of a man proving himself, but the quieter stance of a man learning to be present without a script. Mason held out one of the cups. "I didn't know how you take it now." "However it comes," Malcolm said. They stood in the corridor for a while. Mason looked past his son at the command room. The maps, the monitors, the people moving through the space with focus and purpose. Calling Malcolm's name with the particular ease of people who trust the person they're calling. "I thought the car was what made someone matter," Mason said. He wasn't looking at Malcolm when he said it, but the words were for him. "The car's just a car," Malcolm said. "I know that now." Mason looked at him. "I know it, because I watched you get into it." Malcolm looked at his father for a moment. He touched the face of the watch on his left wrist, the old one, the one Elise had given him the day he completed his federal certification. The crystal was scratched. The band had been replaced twice. It kept perfect time. "Mom gave me this," he said, "because she said time doesn't care who notices it passing, it just keeps an account." Mason looked at the watch. Something moved in his face that didn't have a name, but was close to what happens when a person finally understands that they've been counting wrong. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. They stood together in the corridor and drank the coffee and watched the city's emergency machine run the way it was supposed to. Not for the people who made noise, but for the people who needed it most. Some men are called quietly. Their names don't run across a screen or get announced at a podium the first time or the 10th. They build the architecture that holds other things up. And they do it without signing their name across the front of it. Because the work was never about the signature. Mason Vail had spent a lifetime believing that importance wore a certain face, that it arrived loudly and was recognized by crowds, that a man's worth could be read from the outside. The shine on his shoes, the cut of his coat, the company he kept at the right table. His son had spent a lifetime building something that mattered where it couldn't be seen, and being reduced to something smaller every time he came home. But the convoy had been waiting, not for a title, not for a performance, for the person who knew how to step into the car and do the work that nobody else in that building had been willing to do. They thought the limousine made him important, but the truth was, the limousine was only waiting because he already was. Thank you for watching. This channel is no longer supported by ads, and these stories continue because people believe they matter. Patreon is a quiet way to support the work with early access, story previews, and small moments of input before each tale is fully told. On screen now is a preview of the Patreon page. If you'd like to support the channel, the invitation is first comment down below. I'll see you in the next story.